All right, well, we should get back to Augustine then. Just to kind of remind you what we discussed last time, we talked about his pessimism regarding happiness in this life, and he aims his comments at philosophy, saying that, philosophers have kind of given us a false promise that we can achieve happiness in this life. And so as a Christian theologian, he's saying that is a futile quest, and of course he believes that the Christian faith at least gives people an explanation for why there are pains and miseries in this life, and something else to focus on, namely the next life, okay? Rather than the philosophy's quest to improve and perfect this life. Augustine says the ultimate happiness is found in the next life, and that's not a surprise, okay? So, but you would think then that he would just stop talking about politics and government and so forth, and he doesn't do that. So we don't want to be misleading. I don't want you to think Augustine doesn't have any concern for politics or this world, because he obviously does. But he's just saying, if you want perfection and you want ultimate happiness, you won't find it here. It doesn't mean that we can't do better or worse here, but we can't achieve perfection. And Arnhart makes something of that. He says, a big mistake that is often made in politics is this search for perfection. And when people search for perfection in the political world in this life, what happens is sometimes the opposite of that. You get tyranny in the quest for perfection. Okay? In addition to his teaching about accepting suffering and putting it in the context of faith, we have his acceptance of the doctrine of original sin, which is a gloomy thought, but nevertheless, it's the idea that human beings are born with this corruption, and they cannot free themselves from it. And again, they have to rely on God's grace to be able to overcome it. Okay? And this sinful nature of human beings is a permanent part of our nature. It can't be completely gotten rid of, even for those who have converted and who are faithful. Okay? They're always going to be tempted. There's always going to be this draw to injustice and so forth. So again, contrary to the philosophers such as Plato, who thought that if you understood well enough, you could be perfectly just, Augustine is saying even if you're a good Christian, you can't be perfectly just, because there's always this temptation that pulls people. And so this is why Augustine thinks that government is needed, and that government needs to be fairly authoritarian. In other words, it can't be, just allow people to do whatever they want and hope for the best because they have good intentions. We have to have law and order. Okay? So, given all of these views, which are fairly pessimistic about our chances for improving ourselves by ourselves, there are some options, some political choices in how we can react to this view of the human condition. And one, which he rejects, is fatalism. Okay? One reaction is, there's really nothing that we can do. There's no point in trying to improve things. There's no point in trying to make government better, or maybe get rid of corruption in government, because the sinful nature of man and the harsh conditions of this life just make it impossible. So we just have to accept whatever happens. Okay? Augustine clearly rejects this option. So he doesn't go for the total Christian separation. He doesn't say, true Christians just forget about government, forget about caring about society, and just pray and, do the best you can on your own. He doesn't take that option. So we also have the option of pragmatism, which is kind of a classical conservative position, which is that we can't perfect people in this life, but we can and should continually struggle to improve. Okay? So we should take concrete steps and very incremental steps, and a lot of times we get far less than what we want from government. Okay? And the laws that we pass are far less than total solutions to our problems. But we still should strive to improve, and we can improve our situation, not perfectly, but to a certain extent. And these improvements aren't permanent, they're probably temporary, but still, you know, this is our role, this is our duty, as a matter of fact, okay? Not to just give up, all right? And then a third choice is realism. And in that view, because people are sinners, because people are bad and unjust, they get tempted to do wrong, we need to have a strong government with strong law and order and a strong national defense. And so these people say, you know, the answer is, you know, clamp down, you know, use governmental power to control people so they do the least harm to themselves and others as possible. And if we read Augustine, if we read Augustine, we see some of both of these. We don't see the first option, but we see him sometimes leaning towards pragmatism, sometimes leaning towards realism. So I would say his approach is a combination of the two. He does think that we need strong government, we need law and order, people need to be put under control, and that's why he does not complain necessarily about, you know, some of the old Roman emperors who were very strong and authoritarian. Okay? He only complains if they become terribly corrupt, and so we'll see, you know, he reserves judgment against those emperors who were corrupt. But if they were simply strong and authoritarian, okay, that's not necessarily a problem for Augustine. Augustine, you will not find him recommending a particular type of government, like Plato and Aristotle did. Whatever type of government exists can be better or worse, and he judges it according to how effective it is and whether it's corrupt or not. Okay? So, one thing we know about Augustine is he's not a fatalist, but he's more of a realist. But his realism doesn't just accept any and all badness. Okay? He believes that the best government is both strong and good, okay? And that is possible. And actually, as we'll discuss later on, the very best government is good because it's Christian government. So we'll get into that as well. All right. So the state for Augustine is first and foremost an instrument of force. Okay? So he does acknowledge that. It's not God's tool, or at least not the most important tool. It is a worldly thing, and it is about force. In other words, a government, for it to exist and be effective, has to be able to use force effectively against its own people in order to enforce the law and against its enemies. And it always aims at some worldly good. What are some worldly goods that even a good, strong government aims at? What kind of worldly goods do governments want to obtain for their people?
Money.
Yep, they want them to be prosperous. Do you think Augustine finds anything wrong with that?
As long as he's not corrupt.
Yeah, it's not the worst aim at all. I mean, this is a legitimate role for government to give people a context in which they can make and keep their money and become prosperous. Now, he says that it is not the highest goal. It's not the best. The best is in a Christian position, which is that property and money aren't very important compared to, you know, your spiritual health. But when you're just judging governments and their worldly role, you would expect them to aim at wealth, okay? And it's not necessarily something to totally condemn, okay? What else do they go for, try to get for people?
Protection.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a primary goal, and he has no criticism about that, right? Keep people safe. Yeah. Anything else? Well, he talks about glory and honor. We'll have to get into that in a little bit, but there's maybe some of that too. Now, make sure I don't put these out of order. Here's something he says to kind of give us pause in Book 4, Chapter 4, I believe it is. Let me see here. It's on the 7th page of your printout. Yeah, Book 4, Chapter 4. He sounds like a libertarian here. Probably just an interesting coincidence, but he says up at the top of that page, justice being taken away then, what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? The band itself is made up of them. It is ruled by the authority of a prince. It is knit together by the pact of the confederacy. The booty is divided by the law agreed upon. Okay? Justice being taken away. Okay? He's making a distinction there. But, you know, if a government is not just, which a lot of governments are not, then in a way, you know, there are great robberies. In other words, what's the difference between, you know, getting your pocket picked and being taxed by an unjust government? It's kind of an interesting perspective there. Right? And so there's a lot of that, and he acknowledges that. And he begins to distinguish between better and worse governments on the basis of this criteria of justice and other criteria as well. Okay? Have you ever thought of government in this way? It's like a big organized robbery, organized crime at the highest level. Well, when you think about it, you know, it's not a bad analogy. I mean, even if you wouldn't go so far as to apply it here, there are probably some countries in the world that you can think of where that's truly the case. You know, where it's quite clear. People's property is confiscated. You know, there are some countries in Africa where people try to get goods in to help people, and about 3/4 of it is gone before it hits the shore because it gets taken by the people, the government officials. So he's both pessimistic, but also, you know, he wants the best that he can get. He's pragmatist. Okay? So the way that he deals with the Roman Empire before it turned Christian is interesting. Okay? He says, the title of Book 5, Chapter 12 is, By What Virtues the Ancient Romans Merited that the True God, although they did not worship him, should enlarge their empire. Okay? And to elaborate, he says at the very beginning of that chapter, let us go on to consider what virtues of the Romans they were, which the true God, in whose power also are the kingdoms of the earth, condescended to help in order to raise the empire, and also for what reason he did so. Okay. Is it surprising to you that Augustine would characterize God doing this, supporting the Roman emperors and the empire before the Christian conversion of Constantine?
He seems pretty pragmatic, so I think that he would have allowed for this kind of leeway, especially since it was before really the mass conversions of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so as long as it was, like you said earlier, as long as it was virtuous and propagated justice, then it would have been all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he looks at it very pragmatically. He looks at it as the source of, potentially the source of many good things for people. Okay, so he doesn't condemn. I mean, a more predictable approach for somebody like Augustine might be just total condemnation. You know, before the Christian conversion, the emperors were all about, you know, power and money are bad, and yada yada. And then, you know, we had this change, and the aim became good, and that's not what he does. So he goes on at quite some length describing their virtues, actually. Okay, so for instance, he says, glory they most ardently loved. For it they wished to live. For it they did not hesitate to die. And he points out elsewhere that a lot of Christians, he says, you know, A lot of them were willing to die, but Augustine says, does every Christian have the same motivation to die for their faith that many of these ancient Romans did to die for their country? Okay? So the fact that they were willing to die for their country, to give up everything if necessary for it, is admirable to him in a lot of cases. He says, for every other desire was repressed by the strength of their passion for honor. Okay? And honor, relative to some of the other things that one could want, is better. Okay? So some of these people were willing to die for honor and glory. That's not the best, but it's a strength of character that he admires relative to some other motivations that people could have. Page 8 is full of praise. He says, for instance, the state grew with amazing rapidity after it had obtained liberty. So great a desire of glory had taken possession of it. That eagerness for praise and desire for glory, then, was that which accomplished so many wonderful things, laudable, doubtless, and glorious, according to human judgment. Okay. Again, not the best, because the best is heavenly glory. It's the attainment of heaven. But, by human standards, far better than some other points in Roman history where there was corruption and luxury and where people, emperors and leaders tried to gain things through deceit and treachery, he says, rather than by their virtue or by their strength of character. Again, he says, wherefore by the love of liberty in the first place, afterwards also by that of domination and through the desire of praise and glory, they achieved many great things. And he knows a lot about what they achieved. And he's willing to extol it. He's willing to describe it. Okay? So, did you get a sense that he truly admired them? And did that surprise you when he went on and on and on about the ancient Romans and their quest for honor and glory? And he didn't totally condemn it.
I feel like something that we talked about a second ago was that they didn't necessarily believe in the Christian God, but they still believed in God.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that's something that he might have approved of just because they had a belief system.
They didn't
There
have
was that
right.
call to a higher power.
Yeah. Everything is judged by Augustine according to kind of relative standards when it comes to the earthly things. Okay. Now he does sometimes refer to those ancient Roman gods as demons, because from the Christian perspective, that's sort of what they are. Either that or they're just total falsehoods. But on the other hand, to do something for the love of a god or out of loyalty to a god is better than to do so out of just total depravity and self-love, basically. Everything that a person does that takes them outside of just themselves and makes them aim at something greater, makes them, in the case of honor and glory, you desire other people's respect. You consider your reputation in the eyes of others. That's not the highest aim, but it's relatively admirable compared to wallowing in, total corruption. So it's kind of interesting that Augustine would judge these things in a relative fashion. Ultimately, the truth is none of these things are nearly as important, but as heaven. But some of these earthly goals are better than others. Okay? He says, for instance, desire for domination, that is a worse goal and a worse motivation by far than sort of what's at the top of his list, love of liberty. When the Roman emperors gave people liberty and they promoted their empire as the empire of free men, that was better than when they started to become, just simply desirous of domination and saw their empire as basically a tool to extract goods and money and power from other people. Okay? So I kind of tried to sketch a hierarchy here based on what he says as far as motivations, worldly motivations. Seems like love of liberty is at the top of that hierarchy. Okay? That when the empire extolled liberty, that was when they were at their peak, and when emperors didn't think about living in luxury, but were actually, put luxury aside and did what they did for the sake of their people and concerned about their reputation, they were at their best. Love of glory and honor comes a close second. Okay? And I study the whole issue of honor, so I find this really interesting because, the typical Christian criticism of the motivation for honor is that it's about other people and how they view you rather than simply judging your actions by an absolute standard. You're concerned about what other people think. And it does have to do with obtaining things that other people admire, which may not be the things of God, may not be what God thinks is the highest. But yet the love of glory and honor makes people do great things and makes people adhere to what they say, to fulfill their promises, to do their duty, etc., out of a sense of desire for other people's respect. Okay. So Augustine acknowledges that's a fairly decent motivation compared to some other motivations. Coming in third is avarice and self-interest, and this is where he starts to become very critical. He says when emperors and leaders began to think mainly about just enriching themselves as opposed to the welfare of everybody, when they started to think about what they could grab for themselves, then things started to go downhill. And when they started to think about just sheer power, then they became tyrannical. Okay? And he does say that even in this world, government that's mainly about avarice and domination is less likely to succeed. It's less likely to be successful than government that aims at higher aims like liberty and glory. When leaders are capable of self-control, okay, which is kind of interestingly Machiavellian. Really, when you think about it, Machiavelli could agree with a lot of that. You have to have high aims, you have to have self-control. If you use your power simply to sort of wallow in it and enjoy it and amass as much of it for yourself as possible without really concerning yourself with your kingdom, you'll fail in the long run. Okay? And Augustine agrees with that. Okay? And the biggest distinction that he makes is between these things gotten with honesty and virtue as opposed to treachery and deceit. So he would even, looking at these top two, which are better than the bottom, if glory, for instance, or liberty is gained through unjust means, and this is where he would disagree with Machiavelli, right? Then it is not to be admired and it's not likely to work. Okay? So he condemns the means, and only if a leader is actually upright, and of good character and does things on the up instead of the down, then he's to be admired. Okay, so on page 9 down at the bottom, he gives us quite a bit of information about this view. He says, these arts they exercised with more skill the less they gave themselves up to pleasures, okay, and to the enervation of body and mind in coveting and amassing riches. And through these corrupting morals, by extorting them from the miserable citizens and lavishing them on base stage players. Hence, these men of base character, who abounded when Sallust wrote and Virgil sang these things, did not seek after honors and glory by these arts, but by treachery and deceit. Wherefore, the same says, but at first it was rather ambition than avarice that stirred the minds of men, which vice, however, is nearer to virtue. For glory, honor, and power are desired alike by the good man and by the ignoble. But the former, he says, strives onward to them by the true way, whilst the other, knowing nothing of the good arts, seeks them by fraud and deceit. And what is meant by seeking the attainment of glory, honor, and power by good arts is to seek them by virtue, and not by deceitful intrigue. For the good and the ignoble man alike desire these things, but the good man strives to overtake them by the true way. Okay? Now realize, none of this is in the context of Christianity. So he's making a judgment about these pagans, okay, who don't know Christianity and aren't motivated by Christianity, but he's still saying the ones who are motivated by honesty and by truth, okay, and have a good character are better than the ones who are motivated by deceit and treachery and are basically bad. So he's saying, but even before Christianity, before the Christian influence, we could judge people's character, and some people are better than others, some leaders are better than others. The outcomes for the worldly kingdoms they rule are split accordingly. And those leaders which are of good character, even though they may be aiming at worldly things, like honor and glory and power, are far better than those who are of bad character, aiming at the same things, but taking inappropriate means to get there. All right? So even with the advent of Christianity in Rome, Augustine will continue to judge accordingly, okay? Because many people continue to be motivated by these worldly things, right? And you should be able to pass judgment and evaluate these kingdoms, not simply say, are they Christian or not, and judge on that basis, but what are their motivations, okay? And are they good, and if so, are they successful? And those kind of questions. Okay? So it's interesting that he doesn't do what you would predict, and that's partly what makes him that Christian realist. He takes a good, hard look and long look at a variety of governments and ways of governing. Arnhart comments on page 80, Augustine does acknowledge, however, the genuine political virtues of the ancient Romans. He explains those virtues as motivated by the love of praise. For the sake of political glory, to live after death through fame, Roman politicians suppressed vices, such as the desires for wealth and private pleasures, in order to serve the Roman Republic with their great deeds. This was not true virtue, however, because it was directed to human praise rather than the highest human good. These individuals, therefore, were not yet holy, but only less corrupt. Okay? Yet God rewarded their virtues appropriately by granting Rome temporal power and peace. Okay? So there's the connection to God. Why would God care what the Romans did before they became a Christian empire? Okay? Because he rewards certain better behaviors and punishes certain worse behaviors, no matter what. Okay? It seems to be what Augustine is saying. The decline of Rome came when its rulers were moved less by the desire for glory than by the desire for domination. So he would say that the more corrupt a kingdom is, the less likely it is to succeed, and the decline of Rome perhaps is to be attributed to that and not to the advent of Christianity. Okay, so we know that Augustine judges earthly rule by worldly standards, and he's capable of doing that. But like Arnhart suggests, none of these worldly aims, of liberty, glory, avarice, power, domination, none of them are the best. Okay? And even leaders of great virtue, okay, who are capable of self-control and giving people good government, are not living the best life, because Augustine does reserve the best life for those who are Christians. Okay? So I've sort of answered my question here when I asked what would be the best possible earthly regime for Augustine. He does not identify any of these, okay, as the best earthly regime. Okay? You would think, maybe, given his attraction to philosophy and his continued admiration for Platonic thought, that maybe he would still say, of the earthly regime, the best is the one ruled by the wise. Okay? Not perfect, but the best. Or maybe he would say that those emperors who are good, whether they're Christian or not, but of good character, maybe that's the best we can hope for. Right? Or maybe he would agree with Aristotle that polity is best, but he doesn't. Okay? or democracy, rule by the people. Not at all, okay? Instead, he does turn back to the intersection, the possible intersection between the city of God and the city of man. Okay? So having judged worldly rule relatively, he introduces an absolute standard when he says that if government is run by Christians, and they are true Christians, because he does make a distinction between somebody who's a member of a church and somebody who's actually a Christian. So if they are ruled by true Christians, then, and there you would have the best form of government that you can get on earth. Okay? So such a leader would rule according to Christian principles, and of course that would be for the common good because they would have the welfare of everyone in mind. Does that mean that Augustine is calling for rule by the church? Did you get that out of him? That he would prefer a theocracy if he really could have one?
I think it would just be ruled by the lay, like from laymen, not really from clergymen.
Isn't that interesting? He does not propose rule by the church, okay, or by a bishop or something like that. Instead, you're right, he assumes that rule will continue to be by lay people, so he does not call for a theocracy. And part of the reason for that is because he doesn't think the church always is going to represent the city of God. Okay? That is, just to say government will be run by the church is not to make it better necessarily, because it's the quality of the people in charge that matter. Okay? And since he acknowledges that all people, including Christians, are going to continue to be sinners, you can't just think that because church officials rule that you will get good government. Okay? So that's interesting, isn't it? Because you would think somebody writing all the way back then might just say, you know, these worldly rulers haven't done a very good job. The church is the representative of God on earth. It should take charge. Okay? And many people during the Middle Ages associated with the church said exactly that. You know, they tried their best to take charge. Okay? But Augustine doesn't do that. So because there is this potential for corruption, a church official isn't necessarily a citizen of the city of God. You judge people according to their true motivations and their behavior, not according to their position. Okay? And again, that's part of his realism because he sees all human beings as fallen. So if you can find a true Christian, which is likely to, just as likely to be a priest as a layman, okay? If you can find a true Christian, then you will get true Christian rule. Now, he does get into some of the things that a Christian would be more concerned with. And the type of things that a Christian leader would be more concerned with are somewhat different, not completely, because they're still going to have to deal with safety and prosperity and issues like that. That is always going to be a part of what it means to be an effective ruler. But a true Christian ruler is going to also try to promote the religion. Okay? So they're going to propagate support for the church, maybe even through direct support, financial support, definitely rhetorical support, urging people to convert, urging people to attend church and to pray and so forth. And the laws that such a leader would promote would also have to do with public morality, so he gets into that. A good Christian leader will try to use the laws, he says, to encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior, to make people better. So there are going to be laws against polygamy, for instance. And that's a whole interesting issue we'll get into more in the next few weeks with other thinkers. Anyway, there'll be laws supporting the Christian view of marriage as monogamous and lifelong, incest, child abuse, curfews even, laws against maybe staying out all night, I guess that would be, or indulging in too much drinking and partying, etc. Now, people start to get a little bit worried about Augustine at this point because he had all of his fun, right, when he was young, and now he wants to take it away from everybody else, okay? He sees that it can be very harmful, and I think that he wants laws to protect people against themselves, okay?